Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Katsopoulos, and I'm really very proud and honored to serve as the president of Senior Women Academic Administrators of Canada. I also serve Western as the Dean of the Faculty of Education. I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. SWAAC as an organization does many things in addition to an amazing conference every year. We have a professional development program, which you're going to be participating in today. We have a mentorship program, and we offer all sorts of support to individuals at various stages in their leadership career. So today's professional development webinar focuses on effective onboarding for new academic leaders. And we're delighted to welcome Anna Stuart today. I've known Anna for a long time. She has more than 25 years experience at advising leaders in complex contexts. She is co-owner of KBRS, where she's led and managed the firm's national academic search efforts. And she's worked with hundreds of leaders. And this is how I first came to know Anna through various searches. She's an associate certified executive coach, a fellow of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, and a fellow certified management consultant, mother, wife, daughter, sister, mentor, learner, and servant leader. She's located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And before I pass it over to you, Anna, and I'm delighted to have you join us today and share what your great insights on mentoring, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and I would like to encourage all participants to enter into the chat the location from which you're joining us. So as I mentioned, Anna's joining us from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm joining you from Western University in London, Ontario. And we are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, Chinooktun nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. The meaning of dish with one spoon really resonates with me. In my culture, we often eat as a family gathered around one tepsia pan. And dish with one spoon means we're all eating from one dish with one spoon, and it's a reminder of our collective responsibility to have respect and care for this land that was shared with us and by Indigenous people. So before I pass this over to Anna, I just want to say that our screens will be off while Anna's presenting so that you can focus on her talk. There is a Q&A feature, so if a question comes up, please do enter it, and we will have an opportunity at the end to ask Anna questions. Again, I would welcome you to enter the territory that you're joining us from. And Anna, it's a real honor, and I'm really grateful that when we approached you to share this knowledge with the SWAAC community, that you were so willing to come forward and do this for us. You've been a leader and a mentor and an inspiration for a long time. And very recently, we discovered our brothers work together. So that was an added family connection. So welcome to the SWAAC stage, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Donna. And thank you all of you for taking time to participate in today's webinar. I'm in Mi'kma'ki territory, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada, and just absolutely delighted to join you here today. I get to talk today about something that's been on my heart for quite some time. As Donna mentioned, I was an executive recruiter in the academic space for about over a dozen years. And in that time, I had the opportunity to lead hundreds of searches and interview and interact with over 1,000 leaders. And one of the things that broke my heart was watching new leaders who weren't supported well. So I'm delighted today to talk to you about effective onboarding. I'm going to now share some slides here. So just bear with me while I get that moving. And so hopefully you can see the slides, and I'm going to ask if there's a problem, Donna, if you could just let me know.
Will do.
Otherwise, I'm gonna get us started here with a discussion. I'm calling this a discussion in fives. So what I want to do is share with you 5 reasons why I found new academic leaders struggled in their transition. Then I'll talk about 5 of the key elements to effective onboarding. And then finally, 5 important questions that a new academic leader should be asking as they enter into that transition process. So let's get started. Now, in my experience, there are at least 5 reasons why new academic leaders struggle. And I think the struggle is real. So if you've experienced this struggle as you've transitioned as a new leader, or as you've walked alongside a new leader, perhaps you might identify with some of these. So the first issue, the first reason I think new academic leaders struggle is what I call the plug and play assumption. That assumption that the search committee can often form when they go through the arduous process of identifying and then appointing a new leader. They often can make the assumption that because they've chosen the best person, that they're plug and play, that they can get started right away and they don't need any kind of an accompaniment. Now, I've also seen those search committees who hold the posture, if the new leader can't do that, then they're really not up for the job. So it's all on the shoulders of the new leader. But that plug and play assumption, I think, is one of the reasons why new leaders struggle. A second reason is what I call the imaginary future. And so I see that happen when there's a search committee or an institution that has a dream of a bright, different future. And that bright, different future they believe can be delivered by a new leader. And what the committee fails to recognize is that there are realities that that new leader needs to step into. So the search committee or the leader of the leaders forgets that there are financial and human capacity constraints that can get in the way of that imaginary future. They forget how complex it is to be a leader in the academy. They can forget that there are competing demands and agendas. So while there might be a pervasive idea about an imaginary future, there are all kinds of other agendas at play at the same time. And they forget that change requires people to change, and people don't change quickly or easily. So that's the second reason. The third is what I call the pendulum swing. And so I've worked with committees who want the polar opposite of what the other leader was. So the former leader was slow to make decisions. We want the other side of the pendulum. The other leader was in the weeds, or they were in the clouds. We want to go to the other side of the pendulum. The last leader was too internally focused or spent too much time outside the institution. Either way, we want to go in the opposite direction. It might be that the former leader was focused on themselves. We now want someone who's always consulting. It may be that the last leader was too traditional or was too innovative, and we want someone at the other end of the spectrum. Whenever we look for the polar opposite, I think we're setting the new leader and ourselves up for struggle, because while a new leader might bring an entirely different leadership approach, the institution's usually not ready to embrace that fully. So that's a third reason. The fourth reason is what I call the bait and switch. So this is where the new leader is hired with a mandate that turns out not to be the mandate. And I don't think this is done intentionally, but I've seen this in particular where I've been walking alongside search committee chairs who might be the leader of that new leader. And if you've ever chaired a search committee or any kind of committee, you know that as chair, you end up making a series of decisions, a series of compromises that helps the group to get to consensus. And as I've watched that in executive searches in the academy, what I've seen is the search committee chair, that leader of the new leader, make those compromises, I think with the good intention that once the new leader's in place, they'll be able to share what the real mandate is and get them directed appropriately. But of course, in that circumstance, the new leaders come with an expectation of being challenged by and delivering on something entirely different. And of course, it's often also the case that the leader of the leader doesn't actually articulate that the mandate we talked about is not actually the mandate. And so when we have that bait and switch, we set the conditions where it's difficult to transition well. And then finally, the empty tank. And I think the empty tank is at the core of why we don't do onboarding effectively. After the search committee's done their work, everyone's ready just to get back to the work that they set aside in order to do the search. So there's nothing left in the tank to walk alongside the new leader. And in the academy today, we see more and more turnover. We see more new leaders being appointed. And I think as more new leaders are appointed, we have less and less in the tank to actually walk alongside those leaders to make them effective. So I think those are 5 reasons why we don't have optimal conditions for success for new leaders. So I want to share with you 5 ideas, 5 key elements of effective onboarding. Now, these aren't the only 5, but I think they're an essential 5. But before I go any further, let me just be clear about what I mean about onboarding. So from my perspective, onboarding refers to the processes used to support someone to fully assume and become effective in the new role. So it extends beyond orientation, beyond that initial insertion of content, to actually supporting the new leader to integrate and to be effective in all aspects of the role, in the function of the role, the team, the organization, their relationships, their leadership, and their community. So it's a fairly all-encompassing perspective that focuses both on assuming and becoming effective. So here are the 5 ideas. So the first is, as we think about the content for onboarding, we want to think about 4 C's. We want to think first about content related to compliance. So this really refers to the stuff that you need to know or be compliant with in order to do the job. So it's the policies you need to know, the legislation that might be applicable, any kind of technical credentialing, it's access to any kind of systems or authorities that need to be assigned to you in order to do the job. And I think universities and colleges do this part pretty well. So compliance, we've probably got a check mark beside. The second C is capability. So here's the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities that are needed in order to be able to perform the job effectively. And I think we do a fairly good job of identifying this at the macro level. If you look at any of the briefs that go alongside a recruitment process in a university or college, there's a list of competencies. Now, if you've read as many as I have, what you'll see is there's lots of commonality across those competencies that don't differ in the writing of a brief from level in the organization or by organization across organizations. So my encouragement in effective onboarding is to take that notion of capability from a macro to a micro level. And let me give you a few examples just to illustrate this. So often we'll see that a new leader needs to be able to effectively run meetings, but there's a big difference between what it takes to run a department meeting and a Senate meeting. You might see a competency that says the new leader needs to be able to effectively manage conflict. But again, there's a difference between managing conflict between 2 colleagues and managing conflict between the union and administration or between you and your boss. A third competency I often see is that a new leader needs to be able to present information in order to influence others. There's a big difference, though, in how you do that if you're talking about an academic conference versus presenting at a government meeting where you're trying to influence policy change or funding decisions. Another competency we often look for is the ability to mentor others. Again, there are different there's a different depth of skill and ability, and perhaps even different skills and abilities involved in mentoring a junior scholar versus mentoring a 25-year veteran in the finance function of your department. And often we'll look for new leaders to have the ability to manage finances. Managing a grant budget is different from leading and managing the university budget. So I point these out just to say the same competency can mean quite different things on the ground, depending on the role, depending on the institution. So getting micro about that notion of capability, I think, is really important. The third C is connection. So connection, I mean key relationships. And I think do a pretty good job of identifying who are the key stakeholders that a new leader needs to interact with. What I don't think we do as well is identify what's the strategic importance of the relationship and what does a good relationship look like. So oftentimes we'll name the names, but we won't get more micro in terms of what constitutes effective and good in that circumstance. And I think it's important when we think, for example, about union administration relationships. In my experience, the nature of that relationship and the strategic importance varies across institutions. Similarly, the relationship between administration and a board differs in how it shows up across institutions and the strategic importance it might hold for your role at that institution. I've also noted that small institutions are different from large institutions in terms of the expectations of relationships with leaders. In my experience, small institutions are harder. Smaller institutions typically have stakeholders who expect a much higher degree of accessibility with new leaders than larger institutions. And if you're in a small institution in a small town, which we have a lot of here in Atlantic Canada, there's also an expectation often that members of the community, people who don't even work at the university, will have access to the new leaders. So identifying these nuances at a micro level can help to set a new leader up for success, help them to really understand what is the nature of the relationship I need to form and what would success look like. And then the fourth C is culture, or how you show up, how you need to show up as a leader in order to be effective in the particular role in the particular institution. So culture is not just about reading the values, it's about how do we actually live those out? How do we do things around here? And when I've seen leaders stumble, I've often seen them stumble on some of the small nuances of culture. And what happens is that snowballs. And it's things like, how do we do email here? Do we have a formal tone or an informal tone? What goes in a text message? What do we pick up the phone and call one another about? What's the expectation for response time for emails, text messages, phone calls? Culture can also differ, and these are small nuances, but they can make a big difference in terms of whether we show up on time for meetings. Do we show up on time or do we have an unwritten 10-minute grace period? I've seen both, and I've watched the reaction of new leaders when they've been exposed to what they're not used to. In today's context, what meetings do we do online? What meetings do we do in person? And if we're online, are cameras on or off? Some of these, again, speak to a depth of established culture that might not be obvious as you come in from the outside. Things like, do we eat lunch in our office? Do we walk around? I've seen this with presidents in particular. It can make a big difference if you're not culturally aligned on something as small as that. And then there's the how much time on campus, how much time away from campus that can also trip a new leader up. So I point these out to say we need to unpack culture and talk about what it really looks like in action in order to help enable a new leader. So those are the ideas around the 4 C's, and that's the starting point. The second part is once you've identified that content, I encourage you to break it down into markers and maturity. So oftentimes when we're walking along alongside a new leader, I'll hear the leader of the leader say, things aren't going well. I ask, explain it to me. Well, it's just in my gut. I just have a feeling. And it's pretty difficult for a new leader to understand what's going on in their leader's gut. We want to try and break those 4 C's into observable or measurable aspects of performance so that we're assessing clearly and that the new leader understands what they're aiming towards. But I get why we don't do it. It's really hard to put words around things that we've always measured by gut. But let me give you a couple of examples. So if, for example, we said a new leader needed to have a productive relationship with the union, we might define that as being that there are no grievances, that that's what effective looks like. Or we might define it as no more grievances than we've had in the past. Those are 2 different markers that reflect the same thing. I'll give you another example. We might say that a new leader needs to facilitate collegial decision-making. In your context, that might mean that the faculty reaches consensus on most, if not all, decisions. Or it might actually mean that there's a defensible process in place that we can fall back on to justify decisions. Those are 2 different ways of indicating facilitation of collegial decision-making. But imagine you're the new leader who has one assumption and the institution has another. So that's why we need to break it down into those markers. And I'm going to also encourage that you resist the temptation to define those markers as they should be and really define them as is realistic in your institution. And I'll give you a short example from my own career to illustrate this. So in one of the opportunities that I had in my career, I joined a firm that wanted me to build a brand new practice, a brand new service line. So I did what new leaders do. I developed a plan. I shopped the plan around to get buy-in. I had some quick wins to build my credibility and create some momentum. And then I kept working away at it. But as I worked away at it, it was not achieving the objectives that were set out in the plan. And I continued to work harder and harder and harder and get more and more and more frustrated. And my frustration became quite apparent. So I met with the senior partner in the firm, and he asked, "What's going on? You seem frustrated." I said, "We set out this plan. I've been working hard at it. I'm doing everything I know to do, and it's not achieving the outcomes." To which he replied, "But the outcomes you're achieving are fine. Things are okay." Yes, things were okay, but they weren't what had been set out in the plan. They weren't that imaginary future that we had in mind. And that's what I shared with them. To which this wise and kind man said, "But Anna, we never thought you were going to achieve that plan." What? What are you talking about? At this point, I'd spent 2 years giving up nights and weekends and all the emotional energy I could put into it. And he said, "When you presented the plan, you were so excited. We just didn't want to be discouraging to you." And I share that with you as an example of setting markers, my plan, that were based on what should be rather than what is. So I think that's critical. And the second part of setting those markers is recognizing that new leaders mature in their role. Research says that a new leader takes between 9 and 12 months to transition into the role, to become effective in the role, 9 to 12 months. So we should expect over that 9 to 12 months that there's going to be growth, new learning, and a deepening of capacity and connection that happens over that period of time. But we often go into the appointment of a new leader without setting out what might be accomplished by when, creating markers and a maturity model that indicates what progress looks like over that 9 to 12 months. I once worked with a client in an organization where a new leader had been appointed. And within the first 3 months, that client had declared that the new leader was incompetent. First 3 months. Now, I just said it took 9 to 12 months to transition effectively. 3 months in, they're incompetent. Then confirmation bias kicked in. And this client just kept gathering up evidence that the new leader was incompetent. The new leader was sunk before they even started. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, of course. And I often think if we'd actually sat down and mapped out what would progress look like, the new leader would have known where to invest their energy in those first 3, then next 3, then following 3 months. And the client would have had a much more realistic understanding and expectation of what success looked like. So that's the second idea, markers and maturity. The third idea, and perhaps this is the most important idea, if you walked away today with only one thing, please let it be this one thing. Feedback is essential to effective onboarding. And when we think about feedback, I like to use Fisher feedback. So formation-focused feedback. Feedback that's focused on building up, not tearing down. So oftentimes when we hear the word feedback, we think, ugh, it's bad. Let's focus our feedback on building up. The I in Fisher is informed. So we want to make sure that as we're giving feedback to new leaders, that we're getting the perspectives of the broad audience that engages with that leader, that it's not feedback from one perspective or one lens only. We want the feedback to be specific. We've all had the feedback that says you're too intense, you're too fast, you're an insufficient communicator. It's hard to know what that means, particularly when it's feedback about you. It's hard to see yourself from the inside out. So we want the feedback to be specific. We want it to be honest. In Atlantic Canada, we're so polite that we don't share feedback as honestly as we should. And maybe that's universal in Canada. What is it? Brene Brown says, clarity is kind. We want to share honest feedback, the good and the not so good, where you're aligned and where you're not aligned. And we want the feedback to be empowering. We want it to be actionable by the new leader. There's nothing worse than being told a piece of feedback with no idea about what to do about that feedback. So whenever we give feedback, we want that feedback to be actionable, empowering, and then finally regular. And we can make feedback regular by scheduling it. And so my encouragement is, as we set out to onboard a new leader, or as you set out to integrate as a new leader, you want to make sure you're deliberate about scheduling time when you're going to get feedback. And it will seem burdensome, but it will also make it far less uncomfortable to raise issues when feedback is necessary. So Fisher feedback is, I think, a critical aspect of effective onboarding. The fourth idea, managers. So oftentimes the leader of the leader of the new leader, is busy, too busy to onboard. And is also has this cognitive dissonance about, I'm actually evaluating them, so I don't know how to walk alongside them. But Gallup has found that the manager accounts for 70% of the variance in terms of an individual's engagement, 70%. The effectiveness of a manager has far more influence on whether a new leader, a new employee is engaged, that is happy, productive, using their strengths at work, than anything else. The manager matters the most. And Gallup further found in their research that when managers take an active role in onboarding, employees are 3.4 times more likely to strongly agree that their onboarding was exceptional. And what employees said about their manager's role in onboarding was that they want their manager to be a coach, not a boss. So one of the most impactful things I think institutions can do to support effective onboarding is to actually train, develop, and equip managers to participate as leads in the onboarding program. So helping managers to develop the ability to set expectations, to give feedback, that's Fisher feedback, and to coach, to ask those good coaching questions, those open-ended, simple, short, concise questions that enable the new leader to self-identify what's happening and how they might navigate forward. To be able to give that kind of coaching feedback and to ask those questions in a non-judgmental way, and a way that invites change. Now, we might assume that all the leaders of new leaders have these skills already, but it's been my experience that they're not formed for that. They're not formed for that challenging but so essential role of walking alongside someone as they develop. So HR departments who are interested in investing in enhanced onboarding probably will get the biggest bang for their buck by doing just that, equipping those managers. And then finally, the fourth idea is mentors. And when I say mentor, what I'm thinking here is a guide on the side. Someone who can walk alongside this new leader, creating a safe space for the conversations that aren't comfortable to be had with the leader's leader, with their colleagues, with their team. The mentor is a cultural interpreter, if you will, someone who helps that new leader to understand what happened in that meeting. What am I not seeing? What's the hard question I'm not asking myself about what's going on here? Ideally, the mentors are those that are gifted and motivated to support others. So it's not someone who's in the natural hierarchy of the organization, save and except if they have those skills, that gifting to be a mentor. Ideally, the mentor has some influence in the organization, and that doesn't come from position. It comes from their natural ability and strength to influence. It's also ideal if that mentor is tapped in, if they really know what's happening in the institution, and they have a sense of how the institution's faculty, administrators, leaders are responding to that new leader. Now, it could be someone who's on the search committee, because what I've found is that on most search committees, there becomes a vested interest in the success of the leader. And a search committee has had the opportunity to understand the role in more depth, understand the new leader in more depth, to have an awareness of where strengths might reside and where there might be gaps, where there might be a need for new learning or more in-depth learning than one might expect. So you might think about looking at search committees and inviting a search committee member to be a mentor to that new leader. So those are the 5 key elements of an onboarding program. I'll move then to 5 important questions. Now, I know that if you're a new leader in an institution, the probability of you having had a robust onboarding experience is pretty low. In fact, there will be some of you, either who've been new leaders or who've hired new leaders, who recognize that there's no onboarding program at all, that you have to be self-directed in the onboarding. So if you find yourself in that circumstance, there's not a robust program, you need to be self-directed. I think these are the 5 questions that you want to ask to navigate that onboarding yourself. Or you want to ask even if there is an onboarding program, so that the onboarding program includes the key elements. So the first is who's who in the zoo. I think understanding who are the right connections, what success looks like, why those connections are important is the first part of navigating. So asking who's who in the zoo. Who's it essential that I get to know? Why is it essential that I get to know them? And what does success look like? The second question is what by when? So pushing conversations, creating and really forcing the conversations, especially with those who evaluate you, to understand clearly, what does success look like? What is expected of me and by when? Now, it might be hard to get that insight, but if you're finding it hard, what you might do is take a suggest and validate strategy. So given the mandate that was shared during the search process, here's what I think I need to accomplish in the first 3, 6, 9 months. Do I have that right? That might unstick the conversation. And then I think you want to use that what by when to actively manage expectations. It's so easy when you get caught up in the work within the academy to get distracted by today's issue, the latest fire. You want to keep coming back to that what by when to manage expectations about where you're investing your energy and where you're seeing progress and success. The third question is, what does winning look like? Now, you're not going to ask that question like that in the academy. I get it. But essentially, what you want to do, and you might do this through your listening tours, because most new leaders do a listening tour of some sort. You might ask questions to understand, what does winning look like? And not just not only what winning looks like, but how winning looks. So what are the kinds of things you need me to do as a leader to believe that I'm going to be able to effectively lead you, this team, this vision? So asking questions to really get people to articulate what winning looks like can help you to align better. The fourth question, how will you trust me? So we know that as we lead people, we need to be trusted. And trust usually comes from a combination of character and capability. So as we ask questions about our leadership, what kind of leadership do you expect from me? What does that look like in practice? What might go wrong? If we ask those kinds of questions, that'll give us a sense of the character attributes that our new team, our colleagues, our leader of leaders is looking for. And then we might ask the same questions in terms of capability. What is it that I need to accomplish? What is it I need to change? What is it I need to do that would allow you to believe that I have the capability needed to successfully lead in this role? So getting to how will you trust me, and then starting to deliver on that can start to accelerate the degree to which you're building trust and therefore able to get anything done. And finally, you want to ask, who can I trust? Leadership's lonely. It's lonely for every leader everywhere, but you don't need to do it alone. So you want to find out who can you identify as a trusted advisor inside and or outside the organization. I've had the privilege of being an external trusted advisor to new leaders, someone who they can call and ask in an entirely safe way, what's happening? What do I do? How can I understand this better? So seek out those trusted advisors. You may not have a mentor and your manager may not step up, but don't leave yourself alone. So those are my 5, 5, and 5. I'm going to stop here now, Donna. Hopefully there's some questions from the participants that we can engage in.
Thank you so much, Anna. There's so many things that came up through the course of your presentation. We have had a couple of questions. You mentioned the fact, the idea that, find the person that you can trust. I just want to repeat that for SWAAC, what most of our work is invisible work. It's when we hear from a leader who needs a trusted person, a seasoned expert person who needs to be connected for either a coach or a member within SWAAC outside of their organization where they can have these honest conversations, maintain their confidentiality, and get the kind of support. These are one of the things that we navigate and make these relationship connections quite frequently. We also at SWAAC, we hear from people when they're getting the job because we help with the contract and we help hook them up with lawyers to review the material. But where we also hear from people is when there is trouble. And I think that you mentioned sometimes when things are not going well. But I would say just as equally, there are the instances where we hear from leaders who had no idea things were not going well. As those conversations are tough to say to someone, this isn't working. And so the fit conversation comes into play that's actually quite elusive. So we do have one question, and I would encourage people to put the rest of the questions in there. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I see some are filing in. One of the things that I wanted to begin by asking you is you talked about culture. One of the things that we hear from our members, and even when we're recommending positions to members, there is a real difference in culture going from a small organization to a big organization and from a big organization to a small organization. In some sense, I've always felt that the small organization to a large organization is easier. It's way harder to go from a large organization where you have a lot of resources to a small organization where it's just you. And then you really need a mentor and you really need a coach. Have you had any insight or experiences with this transition of leaders from institutions of various sizes?
Yeah. Yes, and you're absolutely right. I do think smaller is harder for a range of reasons. And so one thing, so first I'll say, just even recognizing that is, I think, important as you think about your next leadership opportunity, or if you're in one of those small institutions, thinking about that as you're recruiting, that it is a significant shift from big institution to small. And not all small institutions are culturally the same either. But first, just identifying that is a significant shift, because what I've seen is people wish it away. Yeah, it's different, but it's not that different. And so recognizing it and then starting to unpack what the difference is. The second place I've seen this matter is in the search process, really understanding so from an applicant's perspective, really understanding what is this experience going to be. So, what are the constraints around resources? What's the staffing of the office? I'll use Robert Campbell at Mount Allison University as an example, and I know I've said this in public places before, so I'm not sharing anything. Robert Campbell, like so many leaders, very gifted in many ways. And one of the things that he did as a leader was he had a very skinny presidential office. He shared an admin assistant with someone else. That's all he had as the president. And he was able to do that because he devoted all of his time to the leadership, and he had a partner who also contributed in that way. And as I led the search for his successor, and as I was doing that, I said, you know, you've not set the organization up well, because the next person is highly unlikely to be able to function well in that context. Half an admin person for a president's office, it's just not realistic. As candidates thought about the position, this was something we talked about. And so I think awareness of what are some of the constraints, what will be different, is important for the institution to have, and it's really important for the candidate to try and dig deep on. So ask to talk to people who've made a transition from a big city to the smaller institution or small town. Ask them what about life they enjoyed in the large city and what they're finding they enjoy and might find frustrating in the smaller city. The favorite story I tell is the red flag that I should have picked up on, it didn't, it was outside the academy, was a woman who was originally from Prince Edward Island, had lived out west all her career and was moving back. And the thing that tripped her up when she got here was there was no Kobe beef. And it's just sounds so ridiculous, but it was a proxy for all the things that existed in Alberta that don't exist here. And had we dug a little deeper, had more conversations, we might have understood better what about big city living really mattered to her and whether or not it would be satisfied here. So that's the second part. So just being aware, then digging deep on it. And I think then the third part is, I think that role of mentor matters even more in the smaller place, because it's little things that trip you up and they get spread quickly. So if 5 people in a large institution hear a rumor, that's a drop in the bucket. When 5 people in a small institution hear, that starts to get into single-digit percentages and maybe even more. So having a mentor, someone who's safe and can be a cultural interpreter, and perhaps even having mentors is helpful. And some new leaders I found have had the best mentor experience when the mentor's been not in the institution, but in the community. So someone with leadership experience, could be a board member who's had that experience of working in a big place and understands the small place. And so is a safe spot to talk about this and can really have insight into what the differences are. So there's a few ideas.
So can I ask you, one thing that I think many of us have experienced is the experience of what we were told is not what we found. So what happens if there's a complete disconnect between what was shared during the interview and what you've discovered when you've landed in the job and what the job has become, which is not what you had thought it was going to be?
Yeah. So I think that happens often. And in some ways, we should expect some of that to happen. It's not possible through the search process that a candidate is going to learn all that they need to know. And it's not possible that the university or college will share all that a candidate needs to know. There just isn't enough time for that. And there's frankly not enough insight on the part of the institution often for that to be the case. And I don't say that to say we need to accept it. I think there's lots of opportunity for improvement there. I think there's lots of opportunity for institutions to become far more realistic about what the leadership mandate is and what the context is, and that it'll set everyone up for success. But I think there's lots of work still to be done in that regard. When you find yourself in that spot, when I've walked alongside leaders who found themselves in that spot, my first encouragement is to try and get as specific as possible about, what is misaligned? What is the thing you're experiencing that's inconsistent with what you heard or expected coming in? So to get specific as quickly as you can. And then to test your assumptions based on facts from the inside and from the outside. So test the assumptions you're making to validate, have you actually got it wrong? Or is it that you don't have enough information to understand what the truth is? And then ask to confirm. I think you've got to raise it as early as you can, but using specifics to try and get that alignment. And then I think you face a decision. If in fact you were invited to do this, but you're really being expected to do that, you've got to ask yourself the question, can I re-engage? Can I engage on this mandate? And if you can't, I think then there's the adult conversations about how do you navigate forward from there. I'll be overly generous, but I think for most leaders who end up hiring someone who feels this misalignment, that the leader never intended to mislead. That leader of the leader understands when faced with it, understands where the disconnect happened. And so there's an opportunity to co-create. Now, I might be generous in saying that will be the majority experience, because I know that's, there are some that don't go that way, but that would be my thought, that the majority, once they understand, would acknowledge, accept, and then co-create what a path forward might look like.
So this leads into a couple of, we've got a lot of questions coming in. And so I'm gonna connect this to a question by one of our guests, Shauna Labman. What you talked about with your leader, but what happens if the new leader is your leader is also a new leader?
Yeah. So that's why I don't think you can just depend on your new leader. I think that that idea of mentors, that idea of trying to establish connections with people who can also be giving you perspective on what's happening in this institution, why is it happening, how are people responding to your leadership, is essential. I don't think you can, even if your leader has been at the institution forever, I don't think you can rely just on their perspective. You need to be attuned to the fact that they have a more direct role in evaluation, perhaps, but I don't think they can be your exclusive or even majority place of insight into culture. It really needs to come in a more pervasive kind of way.
So this is shifting the question in a bit of a different direction. And this is related to conflict. And I will preface this question by saying that when we relate peer to peer, particularly within our collegial governance concept of culture, harassment and civility, academic civility, are terms that you can use when things are going awry. But when you become the leader, and particularly a leader to your peers, there's a considerable shift that happens. What in normal context would be not collegial, now is just a difficult employee, and that difficult employee happens to be your former peer. So what is the advice that you can give to an individual who's now leading their former peers?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And so I'll answer it, but understand, I'm not naive to the reality of how difficult all of this truly is. And so I'll go back to one of the insights I shared in the presentation around talking with people about, what will it take for you to trust me? And getting to the level of, what's the behavior that you're expecting of me? What does that look like in practice? There's an executive coach / writer who's just come out with a book. His name is Michael Bungay-Stanier, and his book is How to Work with Almost Anyone. And I think it should be mandatory reading for new leaders. And in this book, he lays out 5 powerful questions. And his proposition is, whenever you're stepping into a new leadership role, you should sit down with the people you lead and ask one another these 5 powerful questions. And you do it in service of normalizing discussions that need to happen when things go sideways. Because at the beginning, it's all honeymoon, and you don't equip yourself for what happens when it goes sideways. So his 5 questions are, so what's you at your best? What are your strengths? What are you most engaged by? So you want to understand that of one another. The second is, what are your preferences and practices? So how do you like to communicate? How do you like to plan? How do you like to do? How do you like to get feedback? How do you like to stay informed? Let's talk about what that looks like. Third question is, what can you learn from past positive relationships? So when you've had good relationships before, what did they look like? And then what can you learn from past relationships that didn't work? Because we've all had them. And then the fifth question is, how do we fix things when they go wrong? So imagine if you had those conversations with members of your faculty, the team that you're leading at the very beginning. As part of your listening tour, you set out a deliberate objective to create strong relationships using this framework or any framework. I think it places you in a better position when things go sideways to have language to use, because you can lean into the language that the individual used when you had the conversation, but you've also normalized that when things go sideways, we're going to talk about it. And we've co-created how we're going to talk about it long before we ever needed to talk about it. So that's my advice. The other thing I will say is, I don't think anyone is, by virtue of being in a leadership role, expected to take disrespectful and uncivil behavior. And I know that it's fire hosed at leaders for all kinds of reasons. And I suspect that the fire hose has been turned on full blast since the pandemic. And so my encouragement is not to accept it, to draw the line and to deal with it as you would in any other context. And I say this, and it sounds a bit like a throwaway line, but I've watched so many leaders, in particular women leaders, take disrespectful behavior because there's a voice in their head that says, as the leader, it's my responsibility. As the leader, I signed up for this. If I don't, who will? And so my strong encouragement is just to draw the boundaries and respect yourself in these circumstances.
So that leads into a common question about culture. We have been, there's a few questions that have been asking about how do you shift the new culture and how do you take on this mission of changing culture? And it really, the question really resonates for me in terms of, I don't remember exactly how you called it. I often call it hopeful fiction. There was one point where you said, what are the truthful aspirations here, rather than the hopeful fiction of how things might change in a very quick way. So can you comment a little bit about this idea of shifting culture as a new leader?
Yeah. So the simple line I use about culture is culture is formed by what we celebrate, what we tolerate, and what we normalize. And I think where new leaders don't help themselves is that they tolerate things longer than they should, in the spirit of, I'm getting to know, I don't want to offend, I don't have enough credibility yet. So probably, drawing a higher waterline around what's tolerated and not tolerating what shouldn't be. But then the other part that I think could have great power in the academy is what we celebrate. And so oftentimes the most effective colleagues are quiet and do it behind the scenes. They model what we want to see everyone modeling, but we don't have time to pay attention to them because we're too busy with the noise. So celebrating, how are you going to celebrate that? Now, it's not parties and, congratulatory emails or Starbucks cards, but what are the ways in which you're going to celebrate and shine light on the kind of behavior that you want to see more of in the culture? And so I think those are the two levers that a new leader needs to be actively using from the very beginning.
I think we have time for one last question, and this is a really good one. What about the leader that's brought in for that short-term opportunity? You're in there for a year, you're in acting, taking over for a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
If there's, 2 or 3 points for that short-term leader. And before I let you answer, I just want to say that you talked about listening tours. We often hear listening tours, and this is relevant to this question as well. There's a pretty famous book, The First 90 Days. It talks about quick wins, big wins. I've often said that in our work as leaders in higher education, our first 90 days and quick wins are only related to relationships. That there really is, if something else happens as a quick win or a larger win in that window, it's by chance. But really, if you're going to invest in your future as a leader, those first 90 days, the concept of a listening tour, the concept of relationship building is key. But what if you're that leader that's only in there for that first 90 months or a year?
Yeah. So it's tricky, right? So I've had so many conversations with aspiring leaders who are offered these opportunities, and I'm far less excited about them than they are. I'm far more pragmatic about them. So I think, caution number one is understand what it is you're signing on for. If what it feels like is the opportunity to show that you can do it, understand that what you're engaging in is a live interview, right? And so is that what you're signing on for? So know what you're signing on for. What's the agenda and what's your objective in terms of that short-term period of time. If you want to sign on for the short duration project opportunity, I'd seek crystal clarity around what does success look like. And then I'd spend a lot of time talking with the leader of the leaders about whether or not the conditions for success exist. And the conditions for success, Donna, the first 90 days relationship building matters. I'm going to say in the academy, that is the thing. If you never accomplished anything tangible, but you had incredibly strong relationships, you'll have influenced all kinds of things to happen. So, declaring the win on the implementation project pales in comparison to you actually got the academy to move because you were able to influence people, not in a Machiavellian way, but in a way that builds on their strengths and aspirations. So relationships matters more than anything. So I'd ask the questions for this short-term assignment about conditions for success. And I'd ask myself, do I have the credibility to pull it off? And if you step into it, I'd focus on how do I build credibility quickly? And I'd get everyone that would possibly give me any good insight, their insights around how do I effectively build relationships in order to allow me to accomplish this. Oftentimes we get in and we start focusing on the work. The first priority's got to be, can I build credibility? And that's about, can I get people to trust me?
Trust, really, that's the key there. And I think also your point about what is the long game here. Are you engaging in a year-long interview for a position? Is it at your institution that if you do the acting role, you're never going to be considered for the permanent role? So having a clear understanding of what the end game is a priority. So we've reached the end of our time. Anna, would it be okay if I put your email address in the chat for people who wanted to get in touch with you?
Absolutely, I'd be delighted.
So I've added Anna's email in the chat to each of you. I want to, on behalf of Senior Women Academic Administrators of Canada, I want to thank you sincerely for sharing your wisdom and time with us today. I've been so honored to know you for at least 15 years, and it's every opportunity I've had to engage, I've walked away with a level of mentorship that you probably didn't even understand that you were providing. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful that you've shared your time and your wisdom with us today. We will be making this video available on our website, and I would encourage our colleagues to share it with any of their members of their community and their academic community or others who may benefit from hearing this talk as well. I wanted to thank all of our members who attended today and provided and supplied some excellent questions for discussion, and Megha Ajmani, who helps coordinate. So with that, I will thank everybody for joining us, and the webinar will end now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
And please note our next webinar in November.